Lots of commentary today about protesters hurling abuse at Keir Starmer yesterday, and there is no doubt that in some parts of the world, mob rule is very real, and it is a direct threat to free speech. My next guest knows this more than most, and he's a reminder that no one part of the ideological spectrum has a monopoly on political violence. He is Andy Ngo, whose book Unmasked is a remarkable account, there it is, of what he saw on the streets of his hometown, Portland, in Oregon. I can't recommend it strongly enough. It's a wonderful read. I say a wonderful read, Andy, who joins me in the studio alongside Sarah Elliott for another American perspective on things. It's a shocking read, actually. What happened to you is absolutely shocking. And in some respects, it's a miracle you're here to tell the story. Try and tell it for us.
Well, I'm an American journalist who focuses on the American far left, the militant far left. Day in and day out for years, we've been told that the far left can never manifest itself in extremism, or that when it does, that it's completely justified. And in my hometown of Portland, Oregon, which became an epicenter of American Antifa violence, I just wanted to know what their ideology is and what their strategies are. And for that, I've been targeted for violence multiple times.
Can I stop you? Some of our viewers will not be familiar even with the idea of Antifa. What is Antifa?
It's a far-left violent extremist movement and ideology that claims to be anti-fascist. They're made up of anarchists and communists, and they're trying to destabilize local areas where they're able to mobilize, and they carry out acts of violence against other citizens and the state, and they've killed as well.
And they've very nearly killed you.
Yes.
Is that a reason? Can I reasonably say that?
Yes.
What happened to you?
I've been victimized by them multiple times, but the most serious was in 2019 when they beat and robbed me in the streets of downtown Portland. They didn't want me filming them during their public direct action, so they beat me on the head, and I was hospitalized for a brain bleed. And then last year, when I returned to Portland after having to flee it, I was hunted down in downtown and beaten again. And
if anybody's wondering, this stuff is available online. I looked at the footage again today. It's watching you being chased down a suburban street in Portland. It's absolutely terrifying. But you went back again and again and again to do it. Now, I've got a very low opinion of journalistic bravery. I think a lot of members of my tribe, our tribe, tend to be quite vainglorious and sometimes overstate the dangers they face. You faced real danger, but you kept on going back. What was driving you?
Well, the issue with so-called fake news in America happens because a lot of these journalists are based in bureaus in D.C. and New York, and they're not on the ground in other parts of America. And the further that you're away from whatever subject you're reporting on, it's easy to introduce errors. And for me, and as for any journalist, accuracy is paramount, and that requires being on the ground and seeing and filming things. And it put me in a lot of risk, unfortunately. And I hope that the fruits of my labor are worth it. Sometimes it feels a little bit dejecting to still see the denial that happens in the mainstream American left about violence that comes from left-wing extremists. I'm sure Sarah's got something to say on this, but just before I let Sarah come in, I just wonder if you feel there's any read across from America to Britain. I mean, when I think of what happened on the streets of Portland, that sense of a lawless anarchy settling for weeks in a developed, rich city, that couldn't happen here, could it? Well, I don't think Britain is immune in that, even though you have an entirely different history in regards to race relations, etc., we did see in 2020 that after George Floyd died, that the zealotry around that was exported from America around the world and implanted here. And in parts of your country, there were small instances of political violence. But I think that's a bad sign. It means that there are actors here who, even without having the same history, can exploit certain sentiments and cause people to take to the streets and carry out acts of political violence.
Sarah Elliott, as you know, I like to contract out my interviews, at least in part. Have you got a question for Andy?
Well, more of a statement. I want your viewers to know that this is a real privilege to have Andy Ngo here, and he is making the violent left mainstream, and that's what they hate. You know, I've only had one tweet taken down on Twitter, and it was on Inauguration Day last year, and it was Joe Biden, is Antifa still an idea? And that was taken down. That was linking to an article where Antifa had attacked the Democratic headquarters in Oregon. And in the debate, when we're talking about the far right and Donald Trump is being criticized, and we talk about January 6th, et cetera, and Proud Boys, when Antifa is brought up, Joe Biden says, it's just an idea. It's just an idea. Moderate Joe Biden, just an idea. So they completely ignore their violent extremism on their side. And thanks to a journalist like Andy Ngo and GBNews for broadcasting it, everyday Americans now know what's happening across the United States, and unfortunately in places like Bristol, after George Floyd's murder. So anyway, they're a very dangerous faction. They're everywhere, and they're not getting the scrutiny that they deserve.
Andy, what do you make of the fact we do now? I mean, I lament the fact sometimes that we in the UK are increasingly obsessed. We've been obsessed for a long time with American politics, but the culture wars, so much has been imported to the UK, whether it's trigger warnings, I was writing about it yesterday, so many other things. In some respects, I think it's quite healthy. Mainly, I think it's unhealthy. But if you think about what's been happening with the truckers in Canada, there are almost morality plays that we all get to watch. Do you know what I mean? That, you know, it's not just a localised dispute. It's something that we look at from afar. Even we pay into GoFundMe from afar, and then the money gets taken away briefly by the people who run that crowdfunding source. But you see what I mean? That the days when it was just something that happened in Ottawa and it stayed in Ottawa, or a story like Joe Rogan stays something quite localised, a tech story in the States. That global village is something that we're all residents of it, aren't we? I mean, share your thoughts on either of those stories, Joe Rogan or the truckers. Which should we pay most attention to, do you think?
They're both important. Regarding Joe Rogan, I've come out to defend him. The reason why, in my opinion, that there's so much coordinated effort by political operatives and other journalists and media organizations to take Rogan down is because his audience share is larger than CNN, NBC, etc., all the broadcast television. And the criticisms that are lobbied against him, I think, are unfair. And because Joe Rogan is not a news program, the nature of his shows, and he doesn't pretend to be either, are these long-form, casual, essentially conversations that happen to be filmed. And what we have now are bad faith political operatives who are going back over 1,700 episodes, that's more than 4,000 hours of footage, and are looking for things to pull out of context.
And sure enough, they find stuff.
They find stuff. And I mean, what makes Joe Rogan different from a lot of the establishment media is he's willing to give platform to people who otherwise are ignored. For example, back in 2019, when I was pretty much unknown, he was willing to invite me on, this no-name young journalist from Portland, Oregon. And for that, you know, I am so thankful, and so many other people as well. I'm concerned, though, seeing that now he's been putting out some of these apologies, because a lot of times what these campaigns and hit pieces do is you gaslight yourself. You know, any decent person who comes under a lot of criticism should question, did I do something wrong? And they're trying to exploit that sentiment that he's having to make him go back and delete requests that his episodes are being deleted. There's been more than episodes that have been removed already. So he's censoring himself on behalf of what other people are demanding.
Can I just go back to where we started, which is political violence on the streets? And in my introduction, I said no part of the political spectrum has a monopoly on it. Our lead item tonight, reflecting on the fact that Keir Starmer was upbraided and a bit more on the streets of London, this time yesterday afternoon. I mentioned the Canadian truckers. There are those people who say they're not heroes. They're causing enormous trouble and disruption to the lives of ordinary people in Ottawa. Get them off the streets. Point is, there's always several ways of looking at these stories, isn't there?
There is, but I would say that people who are demonstrating peacefully, that's a sacred protected right. in my country as well as yours than in Canada. And I think trying to draw some type of line between that and, or comparison between that and what rioters were doing in 2020 is intentionally disingenuous. These are entirely different activities. And we had more than 24 people who died as a result of the riots in 2020. And that's never caveated whenever we talk about the so-called peaceful protests for Black Lives Matter.
I mean, just in terms of where America goes, big question. How much does Andy's story inform us about where America goes and maybe where Britain follows?
I think it's going to play a big part in the 2022 midterms coming up. I think people, obviously the numbers with Joe Rogan, people don't trust the mainstream media in America. And increasingly when they follow Andy's Twitter account or they read his book, they see that there's another side that's not being reported on. And then that undermines trust in government. It undermines our trust in the press. And I think people just really want all these DAs, which are district attorneys and state attorneys who are not prosecuting these crimes, to get out. And I think we're going to see a real switch over in power come November at the local level as well as at the congressional level.
Andy, one final thought. I don't want you to read the tea leaves for this news channel and TV news more generally, but I want you to reflect just briefly, if you can, on the fact that we're there. We're talking about podcasting. You've got nearly 1 million followers on Twitter. But you ultimately wrote a book about, the old-fashioned book was one of your chosen vehicles for telling your story, which will seem odd to some. I know it's coming out in paperback very soon. Why did you feel it was necessary to go down that particular old-fashioned road of telling a story?
Because on the subject of Antifa at the time, if you looked at what books were available, you had a book that was an Antifa handbook, which if you bought it, some of the proceeds would go to support Antifa Bail Fund. And there wasn't anything that provided the other perspective, which I don't even think I was positing a particular opinion. I'm describing through police records and court records documented acts of violence in statements that are made by these criminal suspects. And that needs to be documented in something that is, it's much more detailed than what you can put out in a tweet or 1 or 2 news articles.
Final thought. Have you been... I totally get what you're saying about the necessity of being, Johnny on the spot, of actually getting out of the newsroom and going to the place where it's happening. Will you carry on doing that?
I can't allow myself to be put in a position where they're nearly able to kill me again. And so they've tried to silence me, but I've continued. I'm persevered. I'm here now. And so, I'm continuing my work, and it doesn't necessarily have to be where I'm put in a vulnerable situation.
And people will understand that. And thank you for your work as well. Andy Ngo, thanks very much indeed for coming in. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.